Now there goes the president on up the hill there. He's been, this is after we found out there was something wrong. And
speeding past.
Yeah, and here's the disappointed crowd left there at the trademark. I went up on the roadway there to ask some policemen. Here we go to the hospital. There's homicide detectives in front of us. There's Parkland Hospital. There's the entrance. Police cars all over the place. There is Congressman Wright. He's teary-eyed, as you could imagine. And there's the presidential limousine, the Secret Service men shaking it over. There's
Wright again.
Wright in Yarborough. There's the Secret Service man is taking a type of a mattress or something out of the back of the car there. And there's Chief Curry. He just couldn't believe it. He had put everything he had into this visit and gave the men all types of instruction. There's inside of a car. I don't know whether that must have been Conley's car. There's some more shots of everybody waiting expectantly. At this time, no one knew anything. Then there goes Ms. Lincoln, the president's press secretary, inside. And there's Yarborough again, Senator Yarborough, and he says the sight was too gruesome to describe. And there's a final parting shot from Parkland.
The film and the quality of the film, of course, you can understand, and also the fact that it was not edited. This gentleman is Bob Walker, news director of WFAA television. Bob, you have some last-minute items there.
That the Vice President is on his way to Washington, where he will be sworn in. The President's children are on the second floor of the White House and have not been told as yet that their father was killed. And the White House news staff is under a state of complete, White House staff, I should say, is under a state of complete collapse. First reports said that President Kennedy was shot from an overpass. Our WFAA TV reporter, Mal Couch, saw the gun emerge from the upper story of the warehouse, which has turned out to be the second floor of the Texas Book Depository, which is a familiar sign.
Let me interrupt you here. This is Jay Watson and Bob Walker at WFAA TV in Dallas. Let's switch now to ABC in New York.
This is Ron Cochran at the ABC News headquarters in New York. Just to recapitulate what most of you, I'm sure, already know by now, President Kennedy is dead. The 35th President of the United States. He was born May 29, 1917 in Boston, the first Catholic president ever elected. He was also the youngest man ever elected president. He was the first American chief executive to face the possibility of nuclear warfare. He risked it with a show of force to protect American interests. Later, he succeeded in achieving an accord with Russia limiting nuclear tests, and that occurred only recently. Now we go to Washington for a direct report from Ed Morgan.
This is Edward P. Morgan in Washington. I have just come from the White House. The president is dead. The word came to the White House from a doctor in Dallas. The scene in the White House is a mixture of stunned disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. I saw McGeorge Bundy, the president's chief advisor on international security affairs. His eyes were red-rimmed. He was silent. He shook my hands in silence. By coincidence, I happened to have lunch with Ralph Dungan, one of the president's other top advisors. We drove back to the White House together. On our way back, we saw clots of students at George Washington University standing in the street listening to the horrible news on the radio. When I got to the White House, secretaries were sobbing audibly in the corridors. Charles Horsky, the president's advisor for District of Columbia Affairs, was walking back and forth in the corridor with his hands beating his forehead. Hubert Humphrey happened to be at the lunch that Dungan and I attended at the Chilean embassy, where we both got the news. The senator's first reaction was one of high indignation, and his audible reaction was unprintable. He immediately went to the Senate, where the news had already been given. There is no official spokesman, ironically enough, at the White House at this moment. Pierre Salinger, the president's press secretary, is not in Texas, but at last reports was on the way in the air from Honolulu to Tokyo with Secretary of State Dean Rusk. At this moment, it seems hardly the time, and yet the inexorability of events make it necessary to report what the order of events is now. Vice President Lyndon Johnson will be the next President of the United States. According to the processes of the law, he must be sworn in as soon as possible. Calvin Coolidge was sworn in New England at midnight, as I recall, after Warren Harding had died in San Francisco of blood poisoning. Harry Truman was sworn in, you may remember, in Washington in April 1945 after Franklin D. Roosevelt had died of a stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia. This news at this point has so stunned the Capitol that there is no rational progression of events. Nobody is thinking about much of anything except the indescribable, incredible fact that the man who came out of Fort Worth with his customary PT boat vigor at 7 o'clock this morning, made 2 speeches in Fort Worth, and then went on to Dallas, is now a man in his 46th year, the youngest president of the United States ever to be elected as such, the first Roman Catholic ever to be elected as such, is dead. This is Edward P. Morgan in Washington.
You got it, New York.
This is Ron Cochran in the ABC News headquarters in New York. Senators, we're told, crowded around 2 news tickers waiting for word of the shooting. Many of the senators remained slumped in their seats on the floor until Senate Democratic leaders called the Senate back into session. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia said the whole nation is shocked by this dastardly crime. And after a 15-minute recess, the Senate returned and had the Reverend Frederick Brown Harris, Senate chaplain, say a prayer. The Senate adjourned after the chaplain's prayer that President Kennedy's life might be spared. That, of course, was before word came that he had already died. Vice President Johnson's office says it has no information to confirm rumors that Johnson has been wounded in the shooting. That, however, was an earlier word, and evidently the Vice President was not injured, according to all the information we have. We were told from Dallas a few minutes ago that the Vice President is already on his way back to Washington. Possibly he is attempting to get back to the airport. I doubt that he has had time to leave Dallas. In any event, according to the best information we have, Vice President Johnson will not take the oath of office as president until he returns to Washington. On the 7th floor of the Hotel Commodore here in New York, where the Democratic State Committee has headquarters, about a dozen women, including members of the staff, broke into tears. All normal activity ceased in the hotel, and in nearby office buildings, they were crowded around radio and television sets, as I'm sure millions of persons are all over the country by this time. And incidentally, you may have seen, of course, a good deal of confusion in our reports. Quite naturally, all of us in the television and radio industry were taken quite by surprise by this event. Obviously, no one could possibly in his wildest dream have imagined that such a thing would happen. The word came, of course, that the shooting had taken place during the normal lunchtime here in New York, and all of us at all the networks rushed back from wherever we were at the time and got on the air as quickly as possible. And we are still operating under more or less emergency and impromptu conditions, but we are staying on the air to bring you the news, every bit of information as it comes to us from the wire services and from our own reporters in Dallas and in Washington. We have just received word that Assistant Presidential Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff confirms that Johnson, that is, Vice President Johnson, was not hit by the rifle fire. The new president previously had been reported wounded. So I think that there's no doubt now that Lyndon Johnson is all right. He was not injured in the shooting. Mayor Wagner here in New York was at a luncheon club. When he received the news, he reported he was watching the news of the shooting on television, described the event as a terrible thing. We'll be receiving various comments by dignitaries and others all over the country. The only thing, of course, that all of us can say at this time is that this was a shocking, shocking thing, something which no one could have imagined would happen, and yet it has. President Kennedy was the first president to be assassinated since William McKinley was shot, and that was in 1901, 62 years ago. And this is the first death of a president in office since Franklin D. Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia in April 1945. There have been only, I guess in this century, only 3 other presidents have been shot at. Besides McKinley, there was an attempt on the life of Franklin D. Roosevelt, in which Mayor Cermak of Chicago was killed, and there was an attempt on the life by a group of Puerto Rican nationalists in Washington on the life of President Truman while he was staying in Blair House at the time that the White House was being rebuilt. That was in 1950. 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to gun their way into Blair House and assassinate Mr. Truman, who was taking a nap at the time on the 2nd floor. 1 White House police officer was killed in that shooting and another seriously wounded. One of the assassins was killed in a blaze of gunfire on Pennsylvania Avenue, right across the street from the White House. Guarding the president, of course, obviously is a very hazardous occupation. One of the Secret Service men traveling with President Kennedy was killed by the gunfire today. We have not received word that any others were wounded. Governor John Connally of Texas underwent an operation for the gunshot wound. He was struck in the chest. He was operated on at 2:30 p.m. today. His condition is said to be serious. It's not described as critical, but serious. The governor was not out of the woods, according to the doctors. They say that the vital signs are good, however. The doctor said Governor Connally had a good pulse. His respiration was satisfactory. According to eyewitnesses, Governor Connally and President Kennedy fell simultaneously. We do not know, of course, at this time whether that indicates that they were both felled by the same bullet, which was fired by a sniper. According to our reporters in Dallas, someone saw the muzzle of a gun emerge from a window in a warehouse building along the parade route, or not far from the parade route. We don't know how many shots were fired. There were more than 1, possibly 3 or 4. Do you have any further information, Ed Silverman? Have you received any
reports? We've got the phone open here, Ron. We have expectancy of a report from Bob Clark any moment. He, of course, was traveling with the presidential party. Here's something just in. It's a report out of Washington. Of course, reporting that 6 members of President Kennedy's cabinet were out of the country flying to Japan when the president was killed today. They were an hour and a half out of Honolulu. The secretaries were advised of the killing, and of course they immediately turned back. They're expected to speed directly back to Washington. Now, this party was on its way to a meeting with members of the Japanese cabinet. Now, in the party en route were Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Commerce Hodges, Secretary of Labor Wirtz, and Secretary of the Interior Udall, and Secretary of Agriculture Freeman. Their wives accompanied them. Of course, when they heard the news, they turned directly back.
I think it's fair to say that President Kennedy's administration is perhaps one of the most traveling administrations of all time, partly because of the availability of jet planes and therefore the relative ease of travel, but also because it was part of the pattern of President Kennedy's method of operating. He liked to travel. He liked to go to the scene where things were happening and to see and hear for himself. And partly because of the president's own inclinations in those directions, there was a great deal of traveling done by him and his staff, but also he surrounded himself with people who seemed to like to travel. And it is ironic that this event should occur at a time when the White House staff, the official White House staff, was largely depleted. You heard earlier that Pierre Salinger, the president's news secretary, was on his way to Tokyo, and many of the other top-ranking officials of the White House were not at their desks, not even in Washington, so that this did perhaps slow up the transmission of news, considering the president somewhat. We have word that the Russian news agency, TASS, carried a flash on its international English language radio teletype circuit at 2:45 p.m. today. The flash said it has just been officially announced that United States President John F. Kennedy has died in a hospital after an attempt was made on his life by persons, as believed, from among the extreme right-wing elements. The identity of the assassin or assassins, we do not know whether it's more than one person. The identity has not been established. Sheriff's officers in Dallas took a young man into custody at the scene and questioned him behind closed doors, we're told. And a Dallas television reporter said he saw a rifle being withdrawn from a window. You heard that on our broadcast here a few minutes ago. He said it was on the 5th or 6th floor of an office building shortly after the gunfire. Kennedy was shot at 1:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We go now to Don Goddard.
With me in the studio here is a man who spent 8 years as press secretary for President Eisenhower and is used to the precautions taken by for the president's safety. And he is Jim Haggerty, now vice president of ABC Paramount Pictures. Jim, what security measures would have been taken in this case?
Well, Don, whenever the president goes any place, there is always an advance party of Secret Service men that go out into the area. They work closely with the local municipal police, with the sheriff's department in the county, and with the state police. They make the advance preparations.
Yep.
During the motorcade, where this terrible thing happened, there is always the driver of the presidential car is a member of the Secret Service.
Sorry to interrupt, Jim. We'll get back to this.
Fine.
We have a phone call from Bob Clark in Dallas. Back to Ron Cochran.
Stand by, please.
Hey, Nick.
Bob, stand by, please. We were having a little technical difficulty. All right, Bob, yes, we are on the air now, Bob. Would you give us a recap of all that you know, please?
Well, first, the president's body has just been taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital to a Dallas funeral home. The body, in a sealed brown casket, was wheeled out of the emergency ward where the president has been since he was admitted to the hospital about an hour and a half ago. Mrs. Kennedy walked quietly by the side of the casket as it was placed in an ambulance waiting outside the hospital.
Bob, there have been reports that there was a possibility that Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connolly might have been wounded. Anything to that report?
One of the women in the were wounded. There has been a still unconfirmed report that Lyndon Johnson suffered a heart attack sometime after the shooting. The only thing I could add to this, I was at the side of the president's limousine when the president's body was lifted out of the car and placed on a stretcher and taken into the emergency ward. At that time, oddly, the vice president appeared to be clutching his chest. He preceded the president into the hospital, which seemed an unusual thing to do. Normally, you would have expected that he would have stood at the side of the president. So this might lend some credence to the reports that the vice president may have suffered a heart attack.
Is he now en route to Washington?
We understand he is en route to Washington. We have this further word from Mrs. Johnson, who left the hospital here about a half an hour ago, said only one word when she was asked about the vice president, and that was that he was fine.
Has anyone seen Mrs. Kennedy recently? How is she taking it? Is she in a state of shock? Is she under sedation?
Walked within a half dozen feet of me just 3 or 4 minutes ago as the president's body was taken out of the hospital. I didn't get a clear look at her face. Obviously, she is grief-stricken at this stage, but she was walking calmly by the side of the casket as it was. We heard the shots very clearly, but it was almost inconceivable at that stage that this was an assassination. About no more than 2 or 3 seconds elapsed before the car that the president was traveling. This was an open limousine that had been sent out from the White House fleet in Washington. This car came to an immediate stop. The Secret Service follow car Some of the agents piled out, then almost immediately leaped back in. We saw one of them pull out a submachine gun. They leaped back into the car, and the motorcade took off very rapidly. It had just entered a throughway. The motorcade did something like 60 miles an hour to Parkland Memorial Hospital, which is some 3 or 4 miles away. The car I was in kept up with the motorcade. We were some 50 feet behind the car carrying the president when he entered the hospital grounds. We, of course, all got out of the car, went immediately to the side of his car. At that point, the president was lying prone in the back seat of the car, his head cradled by Mrs. Kennedy. He was holding one hand over his head. Apparently, he had, when he had been shot, he had clutched his hand to his face. He was absolutely motionless. I think someone who had, was more experienced at this sort of disaster might have recognized immediately that the president had been mortally wounded. I stood at the side of the car for some a minute or two while a stretcher was wheeled out. During this period, the president made no motion at all. The First Lady, again, sat rather holding his head. Then he was lifted by 3 or 4 Secret Service agents, again with Mrs. Kennedy standing by, actually pulling on to him during this period. He was lifted by the agents and placed on the stretcher, wheeled immediately into the emergency ward of the hospital. At this point, Governor Connolly, who had also, of course, been shot and is still in critical condition, was lying sort of half stretched out in the front seat of this the same open limousine. The only persons besides the Secret Service agents in the car with the president were Governor Connolly, and the First Lady. When the president was wheeled into the hospital, Governor Connolly was still lying, again, half stretched out on the front seat of the car. I was surprised at this stage. I had noticed while we were waiting for the stretcher to be wheeled up for Mr. Kennedy, the vice president, who had been traveling in a car behind the president, had gotten out, and with someone by his side, the vice president appeared to be clutching his chest. He walked into the hospital, perhaps a minute or so before Mr. Kennedy was placed aboard the... There have since, of course, been unconfirmed reports that the vice president has suffered a heart attack. From the time the president arrived at the hospital, we went through almost an hour without any medical word at all. The corridor where he had been wheeled into the emergency ward was closed off to all but Secret Service agents. Senator Yarborough of Texas, who had also been in the procession and in the car with Lyndon Johnson, sat weeping quietly in a small hospital room off the corridor. The Secret Service maintained extremely strict precautions during this stage. No one, and that meant absolutely no one, was permitted down the corridor within 50 of the emergency room where the president then lay. The official word that the president was dead was, this announcement was made in the lobby of the White House almost an hour after he had been shot. The only development since that time, and we have still had no further medical details from any of the doctors in attendance, the only further development came just a few minutes ago when the president, the bronze casket bearing the president's body was out of the hospital, placed in an ambulance and taken to a Dallas funeral home.
All right, Bob, we're going to do something rather unorthodox, but the circumstances call for it. We want you to proceed to a radio station, TV station, WFAA, and give us your reports from there. Call us on our number is Susquehanna 75000, extension 385. Those are your instructions, Bob. Thank you very much for the report.
Until we have somebody else here at the hospital, or someone else getting development out, I would not do that at this stage.
Okay, we'll abide by your decision then, Bob. You keep us posted. Anytime you have anything fresh, give us a call and we'll put you on.
Okay, fine.
Okay, fine. Thank you. That was Bob Clark and Del.
TV you were just taking.
You're on the air, Bob, so we hear you. Thank you very much, Bob.
Fine, thank you.
And we'll hear from you later. That was Bob Clark in Dallas. Let's go now to
Let's go now to Don Goddard. With me here in the studio is Jim Haggerty, who spent 8 years as press secretary of President Eisenhower, as you know, and who had a hand in the planning of many motorcades like this to prevent the very greatest dread of the thing that has happened today. Jim is now vice president of ABC. Jim, what precautions normally would be taken, and why did they break down in this case?
Well, I don't think they broke down. There is always an advanced Secret Service detail that goes to any city and works with the local police, the sheriff's office, the state police in protecting the line of route. So when a president of the United States or any official of our country is traveling in an open car, you cannot guard every single window. You cannot guard every single building. So you have to go for a show of force, an obvious show of police protection. In an open car, or in any car that the president rides in, the driver is a Secret Service man, and the man in the front seat is a Secret Service man. Immediately following the presidential car, there is at least one and sometimes two follow-up Secret Service cars. The drivers of those cars are members of the Secret Service, and the occupants are Secret Service and special assigned men from the municipal police force or the state police force or the sheriff's office. I have seen many motorcades, talked to many officials of law enforcement agencies throughout our country and around the world. And each of them say the same thing, that a rifle shot, particularly from a window of a building, is pretty tough to guard against. But the President of the United States, a man in that office, has to be completely faithless about his own welfare.
And fearless.
And fearless. And all of our presidents, I think, have done that way. The very fact that at least the suspect has been seized shows that the security was working to a certain point. But this has happened. Attempts have happened before. And Ron Cochran has reported the other events in front of Blair House in 1950 with President Truman, in Miami with President-elect Roosevelt. But the thing that this one a little different than any others was that this was a rifle apparently used with a marksman. In the past, there was only one other man outside of the Puerto Ricans who fired at a president and knew how to shoot a firearm was John Wilkes Booth. All of the other attempts on the lives of the president have been by screwballs who have fired a gun for the first time in their life at the president of the United States.
Jim, we now have some film, fresh film in Dallas, and we will go to our Dallas newsroom for that.
Jay Watson and Bob Walker at WFAA TV in Dallas, the ABC News Information Center for this area. The eyes of the nation and the hearts of the nation are with Mrs. Kennedy today, and the eyes of Dallas, Texas are held in shame. We have a film available that was, excuse me, Bob, go ahead.
May report this bulletin that a Secret Service agent and a Dallas policeman were shot and killed here today. They were shot some distance from the area where President Kennedy was assassinated. No other information immediately available from there, except one more point here that this Secret Service Lieutenant Eric Kaminsky has said the assassin's weapon appears to have been a high-powered Army or Japanese rifle of .25 caliber. The entire building where the sniper was located was evacuated. If we could get a picture of our map here and show somewhere of the building, it's a Texas school book depository, which means exactly what it says.
This is the car where the president was. This is what we call our triple underpass in Dallas. This is the grassy area where, and it was originally thought that the shots came from him here, and now it's believed that the shots came from this building here. We have a film now, and by the way, we have one of the men, someone, and I should say someone, has been arrested in one of the downtown theaters. They don't know if it was the man who shot the policeman or the person who actually shot President Kennedy and Governor Connally. It's in our process. It's being processed now. We'll have that just as soon as possible. Right now, we have an interview with an investigating officer, so let's roll that film, please.
Oh, no.
You saw a man up there?
That's where the guy was.
Here, open my mic. This is the, of course you realize that the film is unedited, and this is one of the parts of the film without the sound on it. This film was made in one of the investigators' offices here in Dallas, and we will have the interview in just a few moments. I'd like to repeat that we will have some videotape later in the day of the president's arrival at Love Field in Dallas at approximately 11:35 this morning, and 1 hour later the president was shot.
This is filmed in Sheriff Bill Becker's office.
Sheriff of Dallas County. The city of Dallas, well, I know...
Down.
J. Sawyer, your position. Inspector, please. What is the story here now? This is apparently the building that the assassin shot from.
This is the building that the witnesses said they had seen a man up there, and some with a rifle. And also we found some empty rifle shells on the 5th floor.
So he would have been directly above us?
Directly above us. Indications were that he had been there for some time.
Well, has the police department taken any precautions against such an incident?
We thought we had taken all of the precautions that were necessary. But this particular building was not covered as there were a lot of other buildings.
Well, as it stands now, there is a suspect. There were witnesses.
There are witnesses who saw the man.
What did they see as far as the president and the governor?
Well, several witnesses saw him slump over.
The president?
Yes.
And the governor?
And the governor, yes.
You also understand the Secret Service man was in?
This I do not know. I haven't received that information.
How many policemen are there in the city of Dallas?
We have approximately 1,300.
I would assume they're all out right now.
Yes, bulletin here. Police have arrested a white man in the Riverside section of Fort Worth in connection with the shooting of a Dallas policeman. The man has denied any connection with the assassination of President Kennedy.
Of course, there'll be a lot of stories coming in like that. Everybody that's picked up here will be in some way or another connected. We do not know at this moment in Dallas, from the latest word we've gotten from our reporters, from the police chief, and from the sheriff's department, if any of the people arrested so far are actually the person who pulled the trigger. It seems like that the building that the shot was fired from is a building used by the state of Texas to store school books. It's an old building, a building that would be hard to cover. It stands over the viaduct as I guess there are 15 or 20 different places throughout the building that someone could be hiding to take a shot. I don't know of anything. I'd like to speak here for the city of Dallas. We are ashamed at the moment. We are stunned. The whole world is stunned, but at this moment I don't think anybody could be more stunned than the people who live in our city. We have, only a few weeks ago when Adlai Stevenson was here, and you're all familiar with the incidents that took place there, and all of us were commenting this morning, and all of us for the last few days have been commenting that we hope nothing would happen to bring disgrace to Dallas. The messages are coming in to our newsroom from all over the state, coming in from all over the world. We will have, how do we stand on our film, Bob? Have you been able to check? Be about 6 or 8 minutes before we do have. In the meantime, let's show the videotape of the president arriving. Beg your pardon? One moment here. We're queuing. We have the videotape of the president arriving this morning, is that correct? Okay, we are now queuing up the videotape of the president's arrival in Dallas this morning, Bob.
I couldn't help it. I was at the airport broadcasting the arrival. Couldn't help but mention how thrilled the crowds were that the president broke away from his normal routine and rushed up to the fences and shook hands with the hundreds of people, estimate now somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people at Love Field. And I couldn't help but remark what great spirits he was in, and his wife. Their Texas reception thus far had been just wonderful, better than suspected in Houston, perhaps not quite as good in San Antonio, I think above all expectations in Fort Worth. This morning he had stepped out in the parking lot and talked to 8,000 people in Fort Worth, and his wife wasn't along. A few people were disappointed. The president very jokingly remarked, well, it takes Jackie a little longer to get prettied up than it does me. And that's where she is now, he told the crowd. Then he went inside and addressed the breakfast meeting over there at the Texas Hotel where they had spent the night, and then came on into Dallas. And the Dallas reception was just tremendous at Love Field. The crowds roaring and cheering and straining forward to get a good look at the president. And then he and his wife broke away and came up smiling to the fences, walked all along that fence. And now let's see it. I think the videotape is ready of the president's arrival here this morning. There he is.
He's waving at a lot of people, smiling, Secret Service men all around. Boy, this is something. They break right away and come right up to the fence. And the people who waited all morning in this fence are rewarded with a glimpse, and a lot of them with a close look and a handshake with the President of the United States and his wife. And he's coming right down toward us and toward our fine camera positions here. The press is having a field day. Somebody perched up on somebody's shoulders. Secret Service right along with the President, of course. The President passes right in front of a Dallas police officer, right in front of our cameras now. Somebody patted his shoulder, Mrs. Kennedy coming along behind him, grinning all the while. The President saying, thank you very much, if I may be permitted to read a presidential lip movement. This is a bonus for the people who have waited out here. Now, Mrs. Kennedy, right along behind him. The President still moving over towards some phone booths that were set up for the press. The people surging up toward that fence. But there is a fence, and the President waves goodbye, waits for his wife, and back they go to the car. Governor Conway standing in the car.
This is Jim Haggerty. The pictures that you're seeing now on your television set show quite distinctly the Secret Service coverage of the President. There are 3 or 4 Secret Service men right behind the President and Mrs. Kennedy, as Mrs. Kennedy now gets into the car, and the President does. The other man in the car is the Governor of Texas, and the Secret Service men are now getting in the driver and the front seat. The other members of the detail have apparently left to go into the follow-up car, which is the car which will be the car immediately behind the President's car in the motorcade. Mrs. Kennedy and the President, as you can see, are leaving. The Governor of Texas is in the jump seat right directly in front of the President, and the wife of the Governor of Texas is sitting in front of Mrs. Kennedy. The Secret Service are following the car out. They're standing on the running board of the follow-up car, and, as is their custom, until the President's car picks up speed, usually about 20 miles an hour, run alongside of the car. When the car is moving, the Secret Service drop back, jump into the follow-up car, and stay right with him. The driver of the follow-up car keeps his car about no more than 10 feet at the maximum, and usually about 6 feet behind the presidential car at all times, regardless of the speed of the President's car and the speed of the motorcade. The other cars that you see there, I would imagine, are cars for dignitaries and cars for the press corps that follows with the President. One of the cars in the motorcade is a pool car of representatives of the combined news media. There again you can see the Secret Service in the follow-up car, standing on the running board. That car, by the way, has very heavy armaments in it. It has submachine guns. It has the necessary... And now, as you see, the President's car is leaving. We change you now to Dallas.
A gentleman just walked in our studio that I am meeting for the first time as well as you. This is WFAA TV in Dallas, Texas. May I have your name, please, sir?
My name is Abraham Zapruder.
Mr. Zapruder?
Zapruder, yes.
Zapruder. And would you tell us your story, please, sir?
I got out and about a half hour earlier to get to a good spot to shoot some pictures. And I found a spot, one of these concrete blocks that I have down near that park near the underpass. And I got on top there was another girl from my office. She was right behind me. And as I was shooting, as the President was coming down from Houston Street making his turn, it was about halfway down there, I had a shot. And he slumped to the side like this. Then I had another shot or two. I couldn't say it was one or two. I saw his head practically open up, all blood and everything. And I kept on shooting. That's about all. I was sick.
I think that pretty well expresses the entire feelings of the whole world. You have the film in your camera. We'll try
I brought it on the studio. Yeah.
We'll try to get that processed and have it as soon as possible. Right now, we have videotape. A picture of the building of where the bullet came from. Let's take the picture first, then the videotape. Oh, this is videotape now. This is a picture of the hearse leaving Parkland Hospital with President Kennedy's body. As I understand it, the body is being taken to one of the funeral homes here in Dallas. All right, Bob, that pretty well covers it, I think. This is the same hospital that President Kennedy visited in his visit here in 1961. It is not, excuse me. This is the outside shot of the hospital and the people who are gathered there. All stunned at the realization that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas today. Now we have a picture of the building. There is a picture of the building one of the boys took showing possibly one of the windows that was used. The top right hand. Okay, which one was it? Let's see if we can figure it out. There it is. There is a picture of the window where the gun was allegedly fired from that killed President Kennedy today. Excuse me, go ahead, sir.
That must have been the line of fire where I seen out the picture where I was. I was right on that concrete block I was at. And as I explained before, it was a sickening scene. At first I thought perhaps it sounded like somebody make a joke. You hear a shot and somebody grabs their stomach.
I was about 100 yards away from one of our other, the boy and I walked over to see President Kennedy. We were about 100 yards away, and it sounded like there were 3 shots. And after the first couple, I said, my God, they shot the president. And then we walked over and looked down and could see the people on the grass there, and I imagine you were one of the people that we saw there underneath the viaduct. This happened this afternoon about, what time? 12:35. The president died.
Something like it.
The president died at 1 o'clock. They sounded like, at first they sounded like firecrackers, and somebody next to us said they were shooting off fireworks, but then we realized, it didn't take but a minute to realize that they were loud reports, and for those of you who are familiar with hearing a rifle shot, it was a recognizable sound. The videotape that we have, Bobby, what do you have now? Okay, that completes the videotape coverage for the moment. We will have film back in about 15 minutes of the arrest of a person who could be the person who shot the policeman or the Secret Service man or Conley or President Kennedy, and we'll have that in just a moment. Now let's go back to ABC in New York.
Jim, the Dallas Sheriff's Department has found a rifle on the 5th floor staircase of that building you just saw in the picture, the book storage place. It's a 7.65 Mauser, German-made Army rifle, telescopic sight, and one shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells have been found nearby, and apparently they're hooking this as the murder weapon. This is from one of those windows up in the top.
Well, Don, as I said a little earlier, I think this, like the Puerto Rican attempt in front of Blair House in 1950, has to be a planned conspiracy. This is the first time in our history when a rifle has been used and fired at a president of the United States. From the photographs of the building, that carry must have been a couple of 100 yards. And whoever fired it must have been a man that could handle a rifle with a telescopic sight, and I understand they found the rifle and had a telescopic sight on it. All of the other attempts, both assassinations and attempts, outside of the Puerto Rican one, was done with a pistol. And with the exception of John Wilkes Booth, the attempted or the assassins of the president fired a revolver at the president for the first time they were fired again. So this must have been a very carefully planned, terrible tragedy and conspiracy. Again, talking about the security matters, in a large city it is impossible to guard every single window. In the years that I served with General Eisenhower, the only time I ever saw all windows guarded in the line of march was at Tehran, when President Eisenhower went to visit the Shah of Iran. And as you might remember, along about that time, his life had been publicly threatened by the members of the communist conspiracy throughout the world. And they turned out their whole army, and every single window on that line of march in the city was guarded by either an army or a policeman. But that was the only time I've ever seen that.
You felt pretty well covered that time.
We felt very well covered. But in a city, it's impossible. In a city the size of Dallas or New York, you just can't guard every single window. But it happens. And these are the risks that a president always takes. I'm sure that every single president, I know President Eisenhower personally, in the back of his mind always realized that there was a chance where some vindictive person or a screwball or somebody like that would take a shot at him.
It's bootless, Jim, to talk about what might have happened, but would that bubble have bounced bullets if it had been closed?
I can't speak with any authority on the bubble that is now used. I can with the bubble that was used by President Eisenhower, and that was not bulletproof. The bottom of the car that President Eisenhower used, and I would assume is the same as President Kennedy, is armor-plated. And that is for grenades that might be tossed, or a mine, or something like that. But the bubble on President Eisenhower's car was used to protect mainly from the elements, rain or drizzle, so that the people could still see him if it was raining or was drizzling.
Well, this adds one to the case for conspiracy then, and the Dallas police are apparently trying to add another. They've arrested a 24-year-old man, Lee Oswald, in connection with the slaying of the Dallas policeman, and presumably the slaying also of the Secret Service man in another part of Dallas, which happened shortly before the president.
Well, I was interested also, Don, in the reports from Bob Clark, that after the shooting happened, the president's car and the follow-up car immediately left in a hurry, left the scene. This, again, is in line with security measures. And if anything happens, they get out of that place fast in case there are other people in the crowd that are ready.
Yes. Jim, Jules Bergman is down in Times Square for reaction there. We switch to Jules.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still not receiving anything on the PL. Still not receiving anything on the PL.
This is the scene in Times Square as New Yorkers stand stunned. You can see the sorrow on their faces, I think. There isn't, everyone is waiting to hear what's going to happen next, as if,
Which isn't in yet? Which is the one you have to use? This isn't in yet? No. How are we going to use this? Just like this. Well, switch it. Switch cords. What are you doing, Morse? This one will be okay.
disgusting. The New York City Police Commissioner has ordered all policemen to work from 8 o'clock this morning to be held in reserve to 8 o'clock at night to handle the crowds we have just seen in Times Square. Lou Ciaffi is standing by in Paris with the reaction from that stunned nation. We will listen to
One, the news of the assassination of the president has shocked all of France. Here in this Riviera city of Nice, where the leading UNR party is meeting in its national convention, the gay convention mood has given way to one of sorrow. Delegates are sincerely saddened. For despite differences that have existed between our two countries, France had faith in President Kennedy. The words being heard now are terrible tragedy, awful, and the universal attitude is this touches not only the United States, but France and all of the free world. The news struck here in France with a kind of bitter irony. This assassination has been the specter that has been haunting France for years. 3 times extremists have tried to take the life of President Charles de Gaulle. 3 times they failed. And the fatalists have been saying, what if they finally succeed one day? What will happen to our country? Who will be able to follow in the general's footsteps? That same tragic question is now being asked about the United States. Who will be able to follow in the footsteps of John F. Kennedy? General de Gaulle himself was reported to have been deeply saddened by the news. Despite the general's differences with Mr. Kennedy, the general had a deep and faith and respect in President Kennedy. Even when he cast mistrust on the future intentions of the United States, he always made it clear that he was not speaking of John F. Kennedy, that the president would keep his word to defend the free world. In the streets of this Riviera city, in the streets of cities all over France, a kind of gloom has settled the country. Lou Ciaffi, ABC.
The late dispatch from Washington says that the president's body will be brought to Washington this afternoon. And Vice President Johnson is expected to be sworn in as President of the United States aboard an airliner before flying immediately back to the nation's capital. Governor John Connally of Texas, who was shot at the same time as President Kennedy, has undergone surgery for the wound in his chest. His condition is serious, but he's believed to have a good chance of recovery. And now back to Dallas for a late report from there.
Jay Watson and Bob Walker at WFAA TV in Dallas. We have some late film. Also, we understand that Vice President Lyndon Johnson will be sworn in Dallas. Our video cruiser is on the way. We'll try to have that tape for you later, or at least we will have film coverage of that as soon as possible. Let's roll the film now, Bob, and see what it is.
All right. This is some of the motorcade as it ended its drive just minutes before it rounded the turn at which the president was shot and killed. Some of the people on the streets.
And I, just about a minute, I'd say 45 seconds before the president was shot, I was standing right in here and gave the president the applaud. He turned the corner.
There's the president and Mrs. Kennedy just minutes before he was shot.
Mr. Haggerty explained, too, that dome was not on, as you can see there.
Now we're getting down.
Right here is where it took place. Just as you saw...
Now, here is the spot where the president was killed. This is the building in which the shot was fired. In a minute, you'll see a policeman or someone crawling in. Where's the window where the shot was fired from? Now you see policemen with guns, suspecting perhaps the man was still in the building. Bits of chicken, food particles were found in the building indicating he had been there for some time. The weapon has been found. I do not have the exact make of it. They found it on the 6th floor of this building. I just learned that. A German Mauser, I believe, is what it was.
That's out in front of the Depository, Texas.
Right. This was just minutes after the president was shot.
If you remember the picture there where the president turned left in the long shot, it was there that it happened.
Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker. Policemen with the guns, trained. Have no idea at all who these people may be. Evidently, they're clearing the area, is all I can say. President John F. Kennedy has now been dead an hour and 49 minutes.
This is the scene where President Kennedy was shot this afternoon, Dallas, Texas, picking up one of the
Just suspects by the droves, of course, have been pulled off the streets.
Now, the picture you see now is tracing the route of President Kennedy up 11th Avenue on Turtle Creek. Now we're coming into the main part of Dallas. There's City Hall. He turns left, right on Houston Street, and right there is where the president was shot. The films that you have just
The trademark up the top of the picture, sir, he was set to give an address at 1 o'clock, incidentally, the minute he expired.
Okay, Bob, I see that Ron Ryland is. Let him scoot in here and tell what he knows. I think he had the film, shot the film of the man that was arrested. Sit down. This is Ron Ryland. You can imagine the confusion that's going on in the city of Dallas today, not only in our newsroom, but in all the newsrooms. Ron, tell us what you know.
Well, I've just come back from Oak Cliff at the Texas Theater on West Jefferson Street.
Let me explain that Oak Cliff is a part of Dallas.
Yes, sir, it is. We joined a police motorcade that was dashing to the Texas Theater where they had a report of a man coming in there that was armed. Just prior to that, a police officer had been shot in that area, been shot with a .38 caliber automatic. We went to the scene. About, I would say, 200 or more police officers went into the theater and found a man sitting in the second row from the back that was armed with a shotgun. The
crowd, of course, I imagine, connected this with the slaying of the president.
Yes, sir. Any man I think it is armed in Dallas today is a suspect at the moment. The officers converged on this man, grabbed him up, and hustled him out of the theater, all the while he was protesting against the police brutality that they were working him over in one thing and another. They dragged him out. The crowd proceeded to push the officers aside and try to get at the man, screaming murder and all, and they do believe that it was almost a lynch mob.
Ron, did you just shoot the film that we just looked at?
I just got in, Mr. Watson. I haven't seen the film.
Why don't you bring him in? Let's let him. We'll run the film again and let A.J. talk about it. Excuse me, go ahead. Now. Do you know exactly what kind of gun that they found over at the book?
Yes, sir. They have just found the weapon that they believe is the assassination weapon. It is an Argentine 6.5 Mauser that had a 4-power scope on it. Also, in this same area, they found a bag of chicken. They found several bottles of soft drink. And in other words, the man had been planted there for some time.
He could have been there for quite some time.
Yes, sir. I assume that he'd been there for possibly overnight because he did have several things there to eat.
Do you have, excuse me, I've just received word that Lyndon Johnson has been sworn in as President of the United States. More background material on that in just a few moments from New York. I'll repeat. Lyndon Johnson is now President of the United States. He was sworn in just a few minutes ago at Love Field. Our boys are coming back to the studio here at WFAA TV with that film, and we'll have it in just a few moments. Let's look at the film again, Ron, and you narrate it this time because you were there. This is the film we showed just a few minutes ago. Go ahead.
Well, this is just prior to the parade. Everyone was sitting around having a good time. I do believe it was a very fervent welcome for President Kennedy. Everybody seemed to be enjoying it.
And the president made a statement earlier how pleased that he was with the turnout in his reception in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Yeah, I think that everybody was just real happy. As the motorcade came down the street, the crowd all times broke loose and dashed out, shook hands with him.
This is Main Street.
Everybody just seemed to be enjoying and having a good summertime outing.
Right. Now, in just a few moments, you'll see almost the exact spot where the president was shot. Right in this area on down the road.
Yes, so this is a bookstore, a Texas bookstore, right where these officers are, is where the man was supposed to have been on the 6th floor. This is where they found the rifle.
Right.
It was on the 6th floor behind a bunch of boxes stacked in behind them. The crowd gathered quickly. The officers descended on the area and tried to keep people back, but of course everybody swarmed in, and I guess the roof just sort of fell in on Dallas at this moment.
It has.
We went in with the Secret Service officers. We covered every inch of the building from the roof to the basement, and finally they did discover this gun on the 6th floor. There was no sign of the man. About 6 or 7 witnesses said that they had seen this man, but of course at a time like this everybody sees everybody, and it's hard to tell which is true and which is not. The Secret Service agents, the FBI officers, all guarded the doors, would not allow anyone in the building or out. Therefore, I do believe that you'll find that these are exclusive films.
I think
as far as the building itself, this is Sheriff Bill Decker, Dallas County Sheriff. These are officers, and as you notice, they're all armed with riot guns, shotguns, machine guns, everything possible in an attempt to apprehend this man. I do believe that he'll never be taken alive. But
you do believe it?
Well, I don't think they'll allow him. I'm afraid this man at this point is so disrupted he may just do away with himself, if anything else.
That's the conversation we've had here.
The crowd swarmed in and did not necessarily hamper operations or anything like that, but
more suspects here, I guess, huh?
They were all taken over to Bill Decker's office where they were interrogated. Anyone who had said that they had seen anything at all, whether it was actually with the shooting or leading up to it, people hanging out of windows, the sheriff took him over and started to interrogate them.
One of our newsmen, Mal Crutch, said that he saw the rifle come out the window. That's it from Dallas, Texas for the moment. We will have more film, and we will have film of Vice President Lyndon Johnson being sworn in later in the day. Now let's go back to New York.